Boston, Massachusetts, winter 1992. On a cold Sunday morning, when the city's brick buildings exhaled frost into the air and the wind rattled the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral as though testing their resolve, a woman now in her late 60s made her way through the old stone foyer, her coat wrapped tightly around her, a small locked prayer book tucked under her arm, and her breath rising in clouds visible in the pale light. Her name is Margaret O'Connor. She has not missed Mass in over 40 years. Every Sunday, without fail, she comes to that same pew, lights the same candle by the side altar, whispers the same name in her heart. Daniel Reed, the man she loved, the man who left in 1950 wearing a uniform, promising to write, promising to return, and who for over 4 decades didn't. No letter, no word, no sign beyond rumors, beyond silence. Margaret's hair is white now, her hands lined with age and years of longing, but her eyes remain sharp, trained as they are on the crucifix above the altar, on the flicker of candlelight, on each pew, hoping. She folds her fingers around rosary beads she keeps in her pocket, cold metal pressing into skin, familiar weight. The scent of incense drifts through the cathedral, mingling with breath, with prayers, with the echo of organ notes that fill the lofty dome. She remembers when the world outside was still scarred from war, when uniforms meant something different: fear, duty, loss. Daniel had left at 19 with a letter in his pocket, a whispered vow. He'd serve, he'd come back, he'd marry her. The years passed, the city changed. Brownstone row houses lined in snow, phone switches gave way to dial tones and then digital calls. Friends married, children were born, old faces passed on. Yet Margaret remained, a fixture in her pew, speaking Daniel's name softly in every prayer, as though saying his name tied her to hope, as though she could will him back by sheer faith. She never married. She never spoke of him openly, except in whispers to the crucifix. Her mother died, her father died, her siblings scattered across states. But every Sunday in that old cathedral, in the hush before Mass, she closed her eyes and waited. And then, on a Sunday like any other, when the organ swelled, when sunlight through the high windows painted colored shapes on the polished wood floors, she sensed movement at the back. She opened her eyes. There, in the last row, a man in uniform walked in, his hair mostly gray, his posture modest, his boots steady. He paused, scanned the rows, and sat. He sat in the last pew. Her heart stopped. Time stopped. He was not a ghost. He was flesh and bone. Daniel Reed. Margaret held her breath, the candle flame flickering as she looked at him. Older, worn, but unmistakably him. The years between them, the letters that never came, the nights of longing and prayers whispered in her pillow, all of it compressed into that single moment. If this story has touched you like it touched me as I wrote it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, prepare yourself, because what follows will change everything. Back in 1949, in the Irish-American neighborhoods of South Boston, where Catholic faith wrapped around family life like ivy on red brick, where kids played stickball in alleyways and parish halls doubled as dance floors, Margaret O'Connor and Daniel Reed were just 2 teenagers drawn to each other with the quiet intensity of first love. They met at St. Mary's Church, where Margaret sang in the choir and Daniel often helped Father Connors set up the altar for Mass. It was a courtship of glances exchanged over hymnals, of hands brushing near the votive candles, of walking home together on cold evenings after youth group, their breath rising like ghosts into the air, laughter muffled by scarves. The war, the big one, was over, but its shadow still hung heavy. The United States, though victorious, bore its share of scars: ration books, gold stars in windows, men who came home changed, and others who didn't come home at all. Daniel's older brother had been one of those who didn't return from Normandy, and the silence that followed his name in the Reed household had shaped Daniel's sense of duty into something almost sacred. He wasn't driven by politics or adventure, just a simple sense that he owed something. So when the draft notice arrived in early 1950, he accepted it without hesitation. Margaret tried not to cry. She smiled for him, stood strong for him, because that's what women did then. She handed him a small rosary, silver, delicate, inherited from her grandmother, with a single worn bead where decades of prayers had been pressed. And she whispered, "Write me every week, that's all I ask. One letter, one promise." Daniel tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "Every Sunday," he told her, "I'll think of you during a mass, and I'll write after." Their goodbye wasn't dramatic. No tearful station platform farewell, no embrace under rain. It was quiet, sacred, held in the stillness of the church the night before he left. They knelt side by side in the front pew after everyone had gone, hands clasped together, whispering their own silent prayers, for safety, for strength, for a return. Then he was gone. The first week, she waited. Nothing came. The second week, she bought special paper, pale blue with matching envelopes, and wrote to him herself, even though she hadn't received an address yet. She mailed it anyway, to the base where she thought he might be. The post office clerk gave her a look, not cruel, just tired, the look of someone who'd seen this hope before. By the fourth week, she began lighting a candle for him every Sunday. By the eighth, the postman's footsteps made her heart skip, even though she knew better. And by the third month, she stopped asking the mailman altogether, because his eyes softened with too much sympathy. Rumors began. A boy from the neighborhood said he heard Daniel had been transferred to Korea. Someone else said he'd gone AWOL. A woman at the grocery store whispered that Daniel had married someone he met at a base in Texas. Margaret didn't believe any of it, not because she was naive, but because she knew Daniel's handwriting by heart, and she had never seen it in her mailbox. The world moved on, as it does. Friends married, had children, moved to the suburbs. The O'Connor house grew quieter. Her father passed away in 58, her mother in 63. Margaret took a job at the parish office, sorting bulletins, organizing choir music, occasionally filling in as a lector. She lived simply. She kept her room the way it had been when she was a teenager, not out of denial, but because she hadn't needed anything different. On her nightstand, next to the lamp, she kept a small wooden box. Inside, the last letter he ever wrote, dated 2 days before he shipped out. The ink slightly faded, the fold lines worn. It wasn't profound, just a note telling her he'd try to call, that he missed her, that the food was terrible. But her name was there in his handwriting, and for decades that was enough to carry her through. Some Sundays she felt a pang of foolishness. She would sit in that same pew, hands clasped, rosary between her fingers, and wonder if her entire life had been lived waiting for a shadow. But just when the doubt crept in too far, a candle would flicker in a certain way, or the organ would hit a note that sounded just like the hymn they'd sung together, and her heart would soften again. Faith, she'd learned, wasn't about certainty. It was about endurance. She never sought another partner, not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. Daniel wasn't just her first love, he was her only love. In the silence that followed his absence, Margaret didn't build a wall, she built a sanctuary. Every mass was a vigil, every prayer an open door. And though decades passed without a letter, without a single explanation, her belief never hardened into bitterness. It settled into something else, something quieter, older, deeper, something like peace. Daniel Reed had boarded the troop train in early 1950, believing he was stepping into duty, into service, into a calling that ran deeper than politics. A quiet, almost inherited sense of responsibility to do right by his family, his brother's memory, and a country still rebuilding its sense of self after the firestorm of a world war. He thought it would be a year, maybe 2. He thought the world would be familiar when he came back. The brownstone streets, the parish hall, the scent of Margaret's perfume in the church vestibule, and that the letters they exchanged would tether them across the miles like rosary beads counted in parallel. But something happened, and the first thing that happened was silence. Daniel's first assignment took him to Fort Benning, Georgia, a far cry from the winter streets of Boston. He trained hard, wrote that first letter, short, hopeful, filled with little nothings. How awful the coffee was, how he missed her laugh, how her rosary stayed close to his chest during drills. He addressed it carefully. He asked a fellow soldier to double-check the postage. And then he waited, but no reply came. He assumed it was a fluke, a missed address. Maybe the post office had gotten it wrong. Maybe the O'Connors had moved. He wrote again, twice, and then eventually stopped writing, not out of anger but out of confusion so persistent that it soured into resignation. What Daniel didn't know was that his letters never made it to Boston. A clerical error, or something deeper, bureaucratic and unforgiving, had redirected his mail to a wrong zip code. The return address on Margaret's letter was slightly smudged, her writing beautiful but delicate. One digit wrong, and their correspondence fell into a void. And then came Korea. He hadn't planned on combat. He was logistics, assigned to safer zones. But when his unit was pulled north during the escalation, he found himself on the edge of the war, and then over it. In late 1951, Daniel's unit was ambushed in the mountains near the 38th parallel. Several of his men were killed. He and 2 others were captured and forced to march north through snow and black silence into captivity. He would spend the next 2.5 years in a prisoner of war camp in North Korea, the kind of place the US government didn't always acknowledge, the kind of place that stole names and returned only numbers. The camp was brutal, not just physically but spiritually. Food was scarce, the cold gnawed at bone, the guards were unpredictable. But worst of all was the absence of time. How days melted into each other until all you could do was repeat your name under your breath just to remember who you were. He kept the rosary hidden in the hem of his undershirt, stitched with thread from his uniform. It was the only thing he had from home, from Margaret, from the world that made him real. He didn't know if she was alive. He didn't know if she had received his letters. He didn't even know what year it was most of the time. But he said her name like a prayer, and that was enough to survive. When the war ended and the POWs were finally released, he came back not to celebration, but to silence. The army processed him through a station in San Diego, offered him a voucher and a handshake, but no answers. His records had been delayed, no next of kin listed, no forwarding address. It was as if he had been erased. He went back to Boston once in 1955, quietly. He stood across the street from St. Mary's. The church bells rang just as he remembered, but he didn't go inside. He didn't see her. He saw a new name on the O'Connor mailbox and assumed she was gone. Married, moved, vanished into the life she deserved. So he left. Daniel moved west, Colorado first, then Oregon. He worked in construction, took his time. Never married, lived in small towns where people didn't ask questions, built a cabin, worked with his hands, prayed sometimes, but not in churches. Too many ghosts. He always kept the rosary. He always remembered her laugh. It wasn't until the late 1980s that he began to reach back toward the past. A friend at the local VFW had helped him request his old military records. Another friend helped him search voter registries. He didn't expect anything, but then one envelope changed everything. Inside, a photocopy of a church bulletin from St. Mary's Cathedral, dated just a few months earlier, and there it was, her name. Margaret O'Connor continues to lead the Sunday prayer group. Her name unchanged. Not a widow, not a married name, just her. And that was how he found himself back in Boston on a cold Sunday morning in 1992, walking through the cathedral doors, not knowing what he would find, not even sure if it was her, if he would recognize her, if she would recognize him. But she did. The moment their eyes met, every year he had spent in silence collapsed into breath. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to feel. He only knew one thing. He had come back. Late, yes, but not lost. The hours after Mass passed slowly. Margaret didn't go home right away. Instead, she lingered in the back corner of the cathedral, her gloved hands pressed together, pretending to pray while her mind raced with too many questions and not enough breath to hold them all. She watched him, Daniel, as he stood slowly, as if testing whether his legs could still carry the weight of the moment. He didn't speak. He didn't rush toward her. He just waited, hat in hand, as if offering his silence as a kind of penance. She rose to her feet, the old pew creaking under her. Her steps toward him were careful, almost reverent, as if walking across sacred ground. They met near the vestibule, beneath the towering archway where light poured in through stained glass and fell across the marble in colors she couldn't name. They stood there, facing each other, as though the decades between them had all collapsed into that single stretch of quiet space. Her first words weren't soft. "You died for me in 1951, she said, not with anger but with a weary finality, the voice of someone who had rehearsed that sentence for years and never expected to say it aloud. "Why are you here now?" Daniel looked down, then back up. His face had aged. More lines, less light in the eyes, but it was him, still him. "Because I never stopped praying," he said quietly. "But I couldn't come back. Not then. I didn't know how." She narrowed her eyes, not in cruelty but in grief. "And you couldn't write? You couldn't send one letter?" He reached into the inside of his coat, the gesture slow, deliberate. From it, he pulled a worn envelope, yellowed, frayed at the corners, but still intact. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it with fingers that trembled against her will. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 1964. The ink had faded, but the words held. She read aloud, her voice cracking, "If I never find my way back, know that I didn't stop loving you. Not for one day. If this letter finds you, it means I tried." Margaret folded the letter gently and held it to her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. "I wrote that in Oregon," he said. "It was the only letter I ever tried to send. I didn't know where you were anymore. I didn't even know if you'd moved on." "I never moved on," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. I waited through rumors and silence and birthdays and funerals. I buried my parents. I watched my siblings leave, and I stayed here, for you, for this." Daniel didn't try to defend himself. He just listened, and after a long pause, he said, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I didn't come here expecting it. I just needed to see you, even if only once." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, old, worn, its edges soft from decades of use. She handed it to him without speaking. He opened it. Page after page, written in neat looping script, were dates, short phrases, prayers. April 2nd, 1954. Lit a candle. Still no letter. "I dreamed of him last night." June 11th, 1961. Sat in the third pew instead of the second. Couldn't bear the memory. October 7th, 1976. "I think I'm getting old. My fingers hurt, but I'll keep writing." January 5th, 1980. Snow today. It always reminds me of him. He flipped through it slowly, his hands shaking. Then he looked up, eyes glassy. "You never gave up on me." "I gave up 100 times," she said, "but never all the way. There was always something. A hymn, a dream, a candle that wouldn't go out. Something always pulled me back to hope." They sat down together in the last pew, where he had been before. No one else was left in the church. The candles burned low. Outside, the wind blew leaves down Tremont Street. Inside, time slowed. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. "Me neither," he said. "But I'm here now. That's something." She nodded. "It's more than I thought I'd get." The next few weeks were cautious. They didn't rush into anything. They met for coffee. They walked along the Charles River. They visited the cemetery where her parents were buried. He stood beside her, silent, as she placed fresh flowers and whispered her mother's name. They didn't talk about marriage or even companionship. They talked about memories, regrets, stories he had never told, about the camp, about Oregon, about the time he nearly wrote again and didn't. She showed him her favorite pew in the cathedral. He brought her a box of maple candy from Vermont. She made him laugh. He made her cry. And still, they kept showing up. for each other. One Sunday after Mass, he took her hand, gently, respectfully, and said, "You once asked me to promise you 1 letter a week. I know I didn't keep that, but if you'll have me, I'll sit with you in this pew every Sunday until I can't anymore." She smiled. It was small, but it was the first real smile she'd worn in years. "Then that's your promise now," she said, "and this time I'll hold you to it." The weeks that followed weren't filled with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations. There were no re-engagements, no flowers on doorsteps, no bold declarations that tried to make up for lost years. Instead, Margaret and Daniel moved carefully, like two people walking across ice they weren't sure would hold. They didn't try to rekindle the fire of youth because they knew better. What they sought wasn't fire, but warmth, not passion, but peace. They began to meet every Wednesday morning for coffee at a small cafe off Tremont Street. The waitress, a young woman named Jess, always greeted them with a smile and brought their orders without needing to ask. A black coffee for him, tea with lemon for her, and a shared plate of toast. They'd sit by the window, watching the city pass them by, college students with headphones, businessmen in suits, nuns from the nearby convent, and they talked, but only when they needed to. Often silence sat with them, not as an intruder, but as a third companion. Daniel spoke more now. Not everything, but enough. He told her about Oregon, about the 1-bedroom cabin he built with his own hands near a lake that froze solid in winter, about the dog he'd raised, who slept beside him every night and died old and faithful, about the books he read, mostly history and theology, and how he used to write her name in the margins just to see it again. Margaret shared less, not because she was withholding, but because most of her story had already been told. In her prayers, in her letters, in that notebook he still carried in his coat pocket like scripture. She spoke of her father's last words, of how she sang at her mother's funeral, even though her throat had closed. She told him about the long winters when the only thing that lit her apartment was the Advent candle she kept burning on the windowsill. One morning, she brought a small photo, creased at the edges, black and white, faded, of the two of them at a parish picnic in 1948. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. "I remember this," he said. "You were wearing blue. Your shoes didn't match." She laughed. "I only had one good pair, and I got a blister that day." "I would have carried you," he said softly. They visited old places together. The school where she once taught music, now a community center. The bridge where he kissed her for the first time, now wider and paved. The back pew of St. Mary's, where she had waited and he had returned. Each place was a kind of time capsule, but neither of them tried to crawl back inside. They let the memories breathe, but they didn't let them define what was still ahead. One afternoon, after Mass, they took a walk along the Boston Common, where the last of the snow had melted into wet patches under the bare trees. Margaret stopped suddenly and said, "You know, I still have the dress." "What dress?" he asked. "The one I was going to wear if you had come home." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I still remember what you looked like in that blue coat. At the station, you waved twice. I thought that was your way of saying, 'Don't forget,' and I didn't." She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time she saw not just the boy she had loved, but the man he had become, and the man he still was. Tired, yes, weathered, but also whole in a way she hadn't expected. "Let's take a retreat," she said suddenly. He blinked. "A retreat? There's a place in Vermont, an old Franciscan lodge. Silence, simple meals, early nights, no phones, just time." He agreed. They went the following month. In Vermont, everything slowed down. The mornings were cold, the chapel always quiet. They walked the wooded paths by day, read by the fire in the evening. At meals, they sat with other visitors, some couples, some widows, some simply searching, and never explained who they were or how long their story had taken to find its second breath. One night in the stillness of the chapel, Margaret whispered, "I'm not asking for forever." Daniel, without turning, replied, "Neither am I. Just the rest of what we've been given." They didn't move in together. It wasn't about recapturing what had been missed, but creating space for what remained. Daniel found an apartment just 5 blocks from her own. They saw each other most days, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit. They returned to their pew every Sunday, side by side, their prayers no longer for reunion, but for peace. Peace for what was, and peace for what could still be. She still lit candles. He still carried her notebook, and slowly the city around them changed once again. But in the quiet spaces, in the chapel, in the cafe, in the pauses between their sentences, something began to bloom. Not love exactly, not as the world defines it, but something truer, something rooted in decades of silence, in the aching echo of loss, in the faith of a woman who never stopped praying, and a man who finally came home. Years passed quietly after that winter, when Daniel Reed returned to the pew, where Margaret O'Connor had once prayed his name into the silence of 1,000 Sundays. There were no headlines, no grand announcements. Their reunion was not the kind of thing that filled newspapers or found its way into novels. It lived in simpler places. A shared bench beneath an old oak in the common, a handwritten grocery list taped to a fridge, 2 coats hanging side by side in the church vestibule. They never married. That question never really came up. Not because they didn't love, but because their love had already endured every test it needed to. They had no need to prove it, not to anyone, not even to each other. Instead, they built something slower, something steadier, a rhythm of days that moved gently between companionship and quiet devotion. Each Sunday, they sat in the same pew, the last row, left side, just far enough from the altar to let others pass, but close enough to see the candles flicker when the choir sang Agnus Dei. She would sometimes take his hand during the homily, never for long, just enough to remind him she was there. He would nod slightly in return. In their silence was more than most people ever spoke. They spent holidays together, Thanksgiving with her nieces, Easter with his old army buddy's family. They kept birthdays simple. She gave him new slippers one year. He gave her a journal. Inside, on the first page, he had written only one line: "For all the prayers you whispered, this is the one I heard." And when the end came, as ends always do, it came gently. Margaret passed away in the early morning hours of a rainy April day. She had spent the evening before at Mass, had her usual cup of chamomile tea, read a few pages from the Psalms, and fell asleep in her favorite chair. The rosary, his rosary, rested between her hands. When Daniel found her, he didn't cry. He sat beside her for a long time, holding her wrist as if her pulse might return with enough waiting. Then, quietly, he placed her prayer journal in her lap and whispered, "You waited. I came." Her funeral was small but full. The pews held neighbors, parishioners, friends, and a few people who only knew her as that woman who always lit the candles. Daniel didn't speak during the service, but as the procession left the church, he lingered behind. He returned to their pew, the last row, and sat down alone. The light streamed in through the stained glass and settled on the space beside him. And there, in that quiet breath of color and shadow, he wept, for all the years lost, for all the Sundays missed, for all the prayers she had offered without knowing he'd ever hear them. Daniel lived for 3 more years. He continued coming to Mass, always the same pew, always the same quiet smile for anyone who recognized him. He didn't need to explain who he was. His presence was enough. After his death, a small plaque appeared at the end of that pew, brass polished by hand, with lettering so subtle it was easy to miss unless you were looking. It read, "Here, faith waited and was answered. We share new stories every day, true stories that touch the heart, stir the soul, and remind us what really matters. Thank you for being with us."